All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm V, the Florida coordinator for the East Coast Greenway Alliance. Welcome to our first ever virtual Southeast Greenway and Trails Summit. Before we begin, I'd just like to say thank you to all of our Southeast Greenway and Trail Summit sponsors. Very excited to do this first virtual summit. And, a lot of work has gone into this, and it could not have happened without our sponsors. So I'm excited to introduce Bradley Davis, a principal with Alta Planning and Design, one of our sponsors, for this session, Emerging Technology Equals Emerging Trail Users. Bradley, it's all you.
Great, thank you, V, and hello, everyone. Our topic today is Emerging Technology Equals Emerging Trail Users. And I think that we're truly in disruptive times, and I think this presentation is timely and beyond the focus on technology today. It's also largely focused on change management and dealing with disruption and how to plan with uncertainty. So my hope is today you'll be able to take away some ideas to approach not only technology changes related to trails, but also ways to think about transportation and recreation in the coming months. So we live in a time with lots of really weird iterations with technology-enabled mobility, and I think this cartoon helps illustrate that. But there are real world experiences that we're all dealing with today. And I like to show this image because I think we can really relate to this guy. And next slide, please. Oh, sorry, back one. We are all kind of uncertain about trying, something new, and often hold on to kind of traditional ways of doing things. And we often use new mobility technology in conditions that are not really in context with our surroundings. So in this case, this guy is using his e-scooter on a street, carrying his bike over his shoulder, and the street is designed for cars and a land use context that encourages people to drive. And kind of interestingly, this photo is taken across the street from the transit station in downtown Charlotte. And it's probably the most transit served location in the Charlotte region. And it's surrounded by parking lots and garages. And I like using this image too, because we all have this context where we live and work, and it's not unique to Charlotte. So with all of the technology changes, there's a lot of jargon, and so we often find it helpful to provide some definitions for the topic. So what is a trail? I mean, the Trail Summit, kind of a pretty basic question, but when I'm talking about a trail today for this presentation, I'm talking about it in the kind of broadest sense. So we have clients managing federal lands, trying to figure out policies for e-bike use in remote natural areas. We have suburban clients trying to launch bike share systems in suburban office parks so people can have access to the trail systems in those areas. And obviously we have urban clients working with the evolution of how mobility devices are changing the trail experience. So what is new mobility? Kind of in basic terms, it's transportation services that are enabled, defined, or redefined by digital technology. And that can mean, a variety of things, and it's taking these traditional modes and kind of giving new iterations to them. So it's often smartphone enabled, although not always. You often have real-time access to information about a lot of these services. Oftentimes trips are made point to point, and they can be services that are provided on demand. And additionally, some of these new mobility traits are that they are often parts of shared systems. So for example, scooter or bike share, and they're often electric. So new mobility takes lots of forms. It can be e-bikes, it can be bike share, it can be e-bikes as a part of a bike share system. And I list some of these, and the ones on the top are maybe ones that you might find along a trail where you live or work. But I list these ones across the bottom because, increasingly trails, particularly as we move towards autonomous vehicles, some of these types of vehicles, may be on a trail, or people want to test the use of them on a trail. So how do these new and expanded options integrate with trail networks? They can be standalone, personal uses. They can be integrated at trailheads as people trying to get to and from access points or destinations that are along or near a trail. And so we have to think about how these new technologies might be integrated into how we plan, design, and manage trails. So just a few other things related to definitions. When we're talking about autonomous vehicles, we want to be clear that there are two types of autonomous vehicles that we're talking about. One is low-speed autonomous vehicles. They operate at speeds lower than 25 or 35 miles per hour. They operate on fixed routes or off-street and in specific areas or zones, which makes them really ideal for use along a trail. And then some of them are neighborhood electric vehicles, which is kind of a US definition for battery electric vehicles that may be retrofitted to be autonomous. And then the other part of the coin is, or the other side of the coin is high-speed autonomous vehicles. These are very different vehicles in terms of application and consideration. They operate or exceed highway speeds. They mix with vehicular traffic, typically on roadways. And for this topic and how we're talking about autonomous vehicles, these types are not for use on paths or for off-street conditions. So, these new technologies are starting to disrupt, the way we typically think about, trail use in the US in particular. And just by one example, global e-bike sales have increased 20% from 2011 to 2015 to continue to grow in interest. The same with the number of shared micromobility trips in the US. It doubled from 36 million trips in 2017 to 86 million trips in 2018. That's a combination of both dock and dockless bike share systems, as well as scooter systems as they kind of came online here in the US. And ride sourcing revenue is expected to continue to grow over the next few years. And these are all kind of changing the way we get around for both transportation and recreation. So we probably all kind of experienced some of these new types of technology on trails, and they are, bringing new users to trails. Trails often provide more comfortable, conditions for using some of these new technologies, particularly scooters, feeling safer than riding on a street. And oftentimes trails, particularly in urban areas, can provide more direct routes that provide more convenient connections to destinations. Next slide, please. But as I mentioned, with low-speed electric vehicles, we're also starting to see new devices coming to trails, and there's a lot of interest, as I mentioned, in using trails to test low-speed electric vehicles just because of the context. But we've had several clients ask us to think about the trail of the future, particularly for trails that maybe have right of ways, or a more specific context connecting maybe two different destinations within an office park. Oftentimes these vehicles can provide a unique solution to the particular trail that we're working on. But we also have competing needs along trails with the introduction of this new technology. On the picture on the left, we have some people likely commuting, maybe some people using the trail for recreation, or maybe some combination of both. And so we have to think about how these new technologies either support the kind of trail use and behavior that we have for our trail systems, or detract from that. And then on the right, traditionally bike racks are used for bikes, but increasingly they are places to drop or locate things like scooters. And so you have competing interests for limited space. And then with new trail design, as I mentioned, increasingly we're having to think about how we integrate these new technologies into trail design when we are designing a trail that's going to need to accommodate new things that we often may not even be thinking about now. How do we do that in a way that kind of preserves the kind of goals that and experience that we have for our trails, but also promotes some degree of flexibility, or accommodates the new kinds of uses that we are wanting to have along our trails. So one of the things that, as I mentioned, we are focused on is providing a framework to manage change. And so with a lot of our work, we like to start with kind of the policies and procedures that we already kind of have in place. A lot of times we already have the tools to kind of navigate this uncertainty, but we just have to kind of think about them and apply them in kind of different ways. And so, our approach to change, particularly with new mobility, is to kind of make room, test it out, and measure the right kind of outcomes. And I'm going to talk about what each of those means. So in terms of making room, in constrained right-of-way, we reassign space to serve the objectives we're trying to meet. So whether that's widening the trail, or creating dedicated space for a trailhead, for restrooms or parking, how we allocate the limited space we have for trails influences how people use them. And so, this trail corridor project we developed last year in partnership with Oregon City in Oregon. And the corridor is part of the larger Oregon City Loop Trail. And the objective was to determine both permanent and interim trail alignments and safety upgrades to create safer pedestrian and bicycle route between two neighborhoods, while connecting city amenities along the way. We do this, with all of our projects that we all are working on now. But for this project, we took a focus on kind of testing it out, and we integrated a demonstration project. And so demonstration projects and other kind of temporary installations have been used successfully to test new designs and treatments across the country, tactical urbanism or pilot projects. And they offer a faster alternative to major capital projects. They allow for real-time public and industry or private sector input, and they can be nimble and adaptive by design. And so for this project, we hosted a Greenway for a day event where we invited people to look at what we were proposing and walk the corridor to get input, see what we might change or add or enhance with the proposed design to get the kind of outcome that the community was looking for. And then lastly, in terms of measuring the right outcomes, this is the portion of the alignment, and we were testing things related to the quality of the trail, the safety, kind of interaction with adjacent property, any constraints. But we also looked at ways to both do interim as well as kind of working towards permanent solutions, and we were able to kind of measure those as a part of the process. And so you can kind of use this framework in terms of finding ways to dedicate space, testing it out, and then measuring the kinds of outcomes that you want. So we've also developed a series of principles related to trails and new mobility. There are 8 of them, and they are meant to give a framework to think about, how and what you plan for when you're thinking about a trail system. So in terms of prioritizing uses, you have limited space in the right-of-way to move people and to designate, as storage space, which means you need to prioritize uses based on outcomes you want to achieve. And so prioritizing uses provides the framework for deciding how to assign space. Whether the mode is a bike or a scooter or a neighborhood electric vehicle or autonomous shuttle, the laws of physics, aren't changing, and speed and safety are critical considerations for trail design. That means for crossings, you need to plan for the most vulnerable users along your trail system. With the exception of driving personal vehicles and needing to find parking at a trail, trail users can go point to point almost anywhere now. And so whether that's walking or on a scooter, users want to get as close as possible to their destination, and often within a constrained right-of-way. And so the goal is to provide structure and better organize the trail for these kind of competing demands. I think trails by their nature are multimodal, and so we are just thinking about kind of expanding what that means. And so I think you need to assume both trail and trailheads are multimodal. People have an ever-expanding range of mobility devices and services to access trails, scooter systems, e-skateboards, e-bikes, and many others. There are more and more ways for people to get to and use trails, and thought should be given to dedicate space to accommodate a range of users, vehicles, speeds, and space needs. So planning for complete networks. It's important to design trails as a network. Trails should connect people to where they want to go, ultimately. So this means connecting to meaningful community destinations or nature, and that people should also, have safe street connections to trails. So we also think it's really important to leverage the use of digital infrastructure. So digital technology is increasingly the link between trail users and mobility services and information. And so harnessing this technology can enable seamless connections, it can regulate good behavior, and promote trail use. For information purposes, mobile technology can provide dynamic connections to trail information, like wayfinding or other types of information or connections to nearby destinations. And no longer does a trail information have to be exclusively static and geographically located, like at a trailhead. And additionally, digital tools can help manage the use of shared mobility vehicles like scooter or bike share systems on trails. Choosing nimble and movable components is also a really critical part of trail design when thinking about new mobility. And whenever possible, we want to realize that demand along a trail is likely to change by factors like time of day of week, or even the seasons. And our physical infrastructure, to some degree, needs to be flexible to support uses that change over time. So the last one is about measuring the outcomes you want to create. And so your trail design will dictate what users do. So commit to an outcome-based approach to planning, design, and engineering. And by prioritizing the modes you want people using, you can create the broader quality of life benefits of economic development, community health, access to nature, and equity. And just by example, these are screenshots I took of a trail near where I am here in Florida, and we can often see in real time now how busy a park or trail is, and so we can use the kind of new tools and information that are available to kind of plan and manage the trails that we use. So next, I'm just going to go through some different design criteria or ways of thinking about accommodating new technology. Some of these are lean on ways we currently operate and are just adding different twists to what we already do. So the first one is managing trails and technology by vehicle use. And we often do this now. It's the traditional way of managing trail use, and it's often done by ordinance or some type of regulation. And with new mobility, it's becoming harder to regulate by vehicle type. Are you trying to ban all e-scooters, or just shared e-scooters that present parking or volume issues along a trail? So, policy is we've found it to be more enforceable and remains up to date as new technologies emerge if it is written to regulate the concern rather than regulate the specific transportation device. So this may relate more to vehicle mass and speed for new mobility when you're trying to regulate it, as opposed to the specific device. You can also think about designing for trails and new mobility in terms of speed and volume. And we do this now with street design, so it's just expanding this concept to trails. as if you have a small, narrow trail, it can only have so much people capacity, but as the width increases, so too can the number of people and the types of vehicles that can use the trail. So it's just another way to think about trails. And also, as you increase volume and speed, you also want to be thinking about separation between different users and vehicle types. And the kind of third way, we've been thinking about, accommodating new mobility with trails is thinking about experience and different users. And so you can think about shared space for separated space. You can also think about things related to noise or pollution and the type of experiences that you want to create along a trail. And we already do this today. This is a photo along a waterfront, and you have kind of competing needs along this trail corridor. On the right, you have more of a pedestrian-oriented context where you want people to be able to stroll and socialize, or stop and sit on a bench, or talk with others. And then on the left, you have areas where you have people that are wanting more direct routes to get to where they go, and they're probably going at higher speeds, and so it makes sense to separate them in this context. So this is just one example of a project we have worked on, designing a trail along Hong Kong's waterfront, very dense, urban area with a lot of demand in terms of volume and different types of uses. So we thought about ways that you could design for shared space as well as flexible space at the edges. And you can also think about ways that you might design that same right-of-way to have separated space, like I showed in the previous image, where you have some space that's dedicated for slower, more pedestrian-oriented users that might have flexible space that you could change in terms of programming, and then more dedicated space for faster users that want more direct routes through the area. So lastly, I'm going to talk about just some of the trends and responses that we're seeing related to trails, and some of the ways that you might be able to apply some of these ideas to trails in your community. So one of the ideas is about thinking of trails as mobility hubs. They often have similar elements to mobility hubs. So new mobility creates certain demands for curb space or storage and securing facilities. And this mobility hub is really a collection of elements that make it easier to access the shared and active mobility network. And so by example, we'll likely live in a world where most of our transportation is electrified, and you can easily think about how a trailhead in a remote area may need to have solar-powered charging stations for e-bikes or other electric vehicles to access the trail. And so by example, thinking about how that might look, this is an image showing a trail connecting to a street and a transit stop. And you can think about how these could be nodes of activity and access to different types of new mobility or other types of transportation modes like transit. Technology can also be used to regulate how and where these new types of services or devices can operate. This is an example of the University of Texas that is looking at ways to regulate the speed of micromobility devices in different areas. And so we've seen this in plenty of places where communities have geofenced certain areas to have reduced speeds or not allowed the vehicles to operate as one way to manage their use. You can also think about managing technology with wayfinding. And I use this example on the left to think about, not everything has to be digital to deal with new mobility. And often we can use kind of analog or traditional ways of approaching the management of space. This is the Georgia Tech's campus, just putting out, a simple sign to encourage people to park their scooters in a certain area. And, this can be a simple and flexible way to respond to, maybe a location along a trail that's having a lot of scooters clutter or block the trail. But beyond that, we can use, wayfinding signs to both be digital as well as, do additional things like data collection. They can have integrated counters or other things to collect information about, use or other things along the trail. Electric charging is, I think also an important element to consider with new or existing trails. We've been developing a trail in California called CV Link through the Coachella Valley, the 50-mile trail connecting several communities. And they really see this as this alternative, people-oriented corridor that's going to accommodate both people walking, biking, as well as neighborhood electric vehicles, and maybe someday even low-speed autonomous vehicles. But in thinking about the future, we integrated, places and ways to charge vehicles as a component of the trail design. Back to the idea of flexibility and innovation, you can have things like these, container pods to provide bike rentals or, promote, local businesses, and they don't all have to be brick and mortar. Trails can often provide opportunities to incorporate, these types of services and business opportunities with existing and new trail projects. Parking, particularly for micromobility, is obviously a very hot topic, particularly in urban areas where we are fighting for limited right-of-way space and trying to accommodate space to store these new devices, but also, not block sidewalks or bike lanes, or in the case on the right here, a trail access point to the Beltline Trail in Atlanta. It was a popular point for dropping, scooters, and it was starting to kind of cause some conflict points in terms of people accessing the trail. We also want to mention, equity as a, component of thinking about new mobility and technology. There are, a variety of different ways to think about equity related to new mobility, but I think the kind of key things are thinking in terms of, vehicle access and in terms of platform access. And so there are a variety of ways that communities have, approached that with new mobility, practically with e-scooter programs or bike share, thinking about ways they can require operators to locate bikes or scooters in a wider geographic area so that more people can access them, providing incentives or subsidies for rental costs for low-income residents, or even thinking about ways that you can pay for the use of the service without having to have a credit card or use a mobile app, are all ways that you can have lower barriers of access to these new systems and technology. This new technology and all of these new devices are giving us new ways to understand how, where, and when trails are being used. And they really provide an opportunity to think about how we can take this information and better manage our trails or incorporate them into design. And so areas where you have lots of activity or use, maybe you need to have design a wider trail or create more space for storage at those access points. And they can also be opportunities to look at ways to improve, or areas that need improvement for safety. And as I mentioned, related to safety, some of the things to think about related to safety, trails, and new mobility is thinking about on a trail versus on the road in terms of trail crossings or those transitions to trail access points. And this image here is just highlighting that in areas where they are more bike friendly, that have a more robust bike network, they saw fewer e-scooter injuries. And I think a lot of that's related to having that dedicated space and a safer system to use. And so you can take those same kind of principles and ideas and apply them to your trail networks and to the streets where they connect to trails. So lastly, I wanted to just mention that we can take some of the ways that we currently think about trail design and just kind of expand them to incorporate this new technology. And so for intersection design or for wayfinding, these are some examples of ways that we've been thinking about how to accommodate things like neighborhood electric vehicles. This is a project we did in Peachtree City that already has an extensive network of trails that are used by people driving golf carts. And so the image on the bottom left is just taking the concept of a protected intersection for people biking, kind of expanding it to think about how it could incorporate golf carts or neighborhood electric vehicles. So what's next? I think the thing that we always try to impress is that there is no silver bullet for these kinds of things, that they are dynamic, they're changing. And really we found that the most successful approach is by grounding the ways that you approach new mobility and trails by incorporating them and leaning on kind of local context and goals. And so using the planning process that you have, the goals that you have related to, connections to neighborhoods or supporting quality of life or economic development, those go out the door with all this new technology. And so you can kind of use those as guideposts to make decisions about how you are designing and managing trails in your community. So we like to just pose some of these questions, and hopefully they are helpful for you in terms of thinking about how you can take some of the things that we discussed today and start to apply them to trails in your community. So asking questions like, who does the trail serve today and who might it serve tomorrow? Can the trail's current design accommodate different uses? Is it too narrow? Does it have adequate parking space? These are all kinds of questions that we need to think about. And if it does or does not, then we need to think about regulating, how and when and who is using the trail. Thinking about community input and desires and values, like I mentioned, incorporating those into decision making and using those as a framework to screen different options. How can you make technology work for you? I think particularly with ride hailing services like Uber and Lyft, there was a wave of feeling like we couldn't do much to deal with these new technologies and kind of what the impacts are. But I think particularly with e-scooters and bike share systems, a lot of communities have found their legs and feel more empowered to negotiate and work with providers to create the kind of outcomes that they want. And then lastly, how do we define and evaluate success? Like I mentioned previously, getting the right framework in place to define what success looks like will ultimately set you up to get the kind of outcomes that you are looking for. So with that, I want to thank everyone for your time. I certainly hope these are helpful and at least spark some conversations for areas and places where you're working. We really find that it's about having the right conversations, knowing what you know, and then trying to explore ways to tackle things that you don't know in kind of a orderly process to create the kind of trail experiences that you want in your community. So thank you very much for your time, and be good.
Thank you, Bradley. These were really wonderful, projects that you shared, and I know that it'll help a lot of our partners, navigate a rapidly changing industry. Thank you for your time. I will also say that any glitches were completely on me. I was, forwarding the slides for Bradley. So thank you for your patience. And I'll just reiterate, if you have any questions or comments on this particular session, to please join the conversation on Twitter, #Greenway Summit. You can shoot over any comments or questions to Bradley, the handle there at Alta Planning. And we look forward to hearing more from all our attendees there. Thank you so much.